Canada's modern borders,
Mhm.
they were definitely not drawn with polite handshakes.
Oh, absolutely not.
Right. Because if you actually look at the historical records, the nation that you see on the map today was, well, it was forged by Viking incursions, devastating biology, a massive translation error, and an absolute obsession with beaver pelts.
It is a wild mix of factors, right?
Yeah, it totally is. So, welcome to this deep dive. Today, we are opening up the Discover Canada Guide, specifically pages 14 through 18, to figure out how a landscape of colliding empires and fierce survival strategies transformed into the second largest country on Earth.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah, and doing that really requires throwing out that comforting sort of stereotype delusion we all hold of history just happening in these civilized, orderly boardrooms.
Right, guys with powdered wigs signing papers.
Exactly. To actually understand the mechanics of how this nation was built, you have to start by completely erasing the modern borders from your mind. Erase the cities, the highways, all of it. Which, I mean, that brings us to the fundamental starting point of these records. Long before a single European sail appeared on the Atlantic horizon, every region of this continent was already occupied.
I'll occupy, yeah.
We're looking at a vibrant, incredibly diverse, and fully populated landscape. And what strikes me in these notes is the sheer, the mechanical efficiency of these pre-contact societies.
Oh, for sure. They were deeply, systematically adapted to their specific geographies. The source material outlines this beautifully by contrasting the different survival strategies.
Like the Huron-Wendat and the Iroquois.
Right, exactly. You look at them, and these were established agricultural societies. They were farmers and hunters managing complex, settled communities. But then you move to the Cree and the Dean, and the strategy completely shifts.
Because the environment demands it, you know.
Precisely.
They were highly mobile hunters and gatherers. And the specialization gets even more intense the further out you go.
It really does.
Yeah. Like in the unforgiving, frozen environment of the Arctic, the Inuit engineered a survival strategy entirely dependent on the specific wildlife of the ice. Meanwhile, all the way over on the West Coast, communities developed sophisticated methods for preserving fish by drying and smoking it.
Which is huge because it allowed them to sustain large populations without constantly moving around.
Exactly. So when you map all of those different strategies together, you realize you are looking at a closed-loop system.
A fully self-sustaining ecosystem.
Yeah. It was a massive, highly functional economic and social ecosystem. Every group had their survival mechanisms just dialed into the exact constraints of their climate.
And then a completely unknown variable is dropped right into the middle of that perfectly balanced equation.
The arrival of the Europeans.
Right. But what is fascinating here is that the initial disruption wasn't driven by massive armies. It was driven by biology.
Which is such a dark turn in the records.
It is the tragic reality of the first 2 centuries of contact. The sources detail a profound duality during this era. On one hand, you have the devastating introduction of European diseases.
Diseases that they had no defense against.
None. These were illnesses for which the indigenous populations simply possessed zero biological immunity. The sheer demographic collapse that followed fundamentally destabilized the existing power structures across the continent.
But the records also show that the indigenous populations, they weren't just passive observers to this disruption, they actively adapted to it.
Far from passive. Alongside the biological devastation, that same 200-year window saw the creation of incredibly deep, complex networks.
Trade networks, mostly.
Trade, military, religious, European contact brought new economic opportunities, which led to the forging of powerful new alliances and, yes, intense conflicts. Indigenous groups weaponized European trade to their own advantage against rival groups.
Wow, so they were playing the geopolitical game, too.
Absolutely. Those early economic and military ties literally formed the foundational base of what would become modern Canada.
Which forces us to ask, who exactly is arriving from across the ocean to trigger this massive rewiring of the continent? Because the timeline in our sources completely shatters the usual narrative that everything started in the 1400s.
Oh yeah, you have to rewind way back.
Roughly 1,000 years, right?
Right. The Viking expeditions, they were navigating those freezing North Atlantic waters from Iceland and Greenland long before the Age of Discovery.
And they actually reached Labrador and Newfoundland.
They did.
And we know this isn't just like mythological lore because the records point to the Lanzo Meadow site. We have the actual archaeological proof of their presence.
Which is incredible to think about.
It is. But the Vikings eventually leave, and the timeline jumps forward to deliberate mapping. In 1497, John Cabot arrives to map the Atlantic coast.
Hmm.
Then, between 1534 and 1542, Jacques Cartier makes 3 separate voyages for France. And this is where I hit a detail in the sources that I genuinely couldn't believe.
The naming of the country.
Yes, Cartier is interacting with his local indigenous guys, and he hears the Iroquoian word kanata.
Right.
According to the notes, that word literally translates to village or settlement. Cartier writes it down, and somehow over time, that word morphs and starts appearing on European maps as Canada.
Yeah, the transition is pretty wild.
I have to pause here. Wait, are you telling me that a massive continent-spanning country is basically named after a literal translation error for village?
What's fascinating here is how casual misunderstandings between different cultures can literally cement national identities on a map forever.
It's just so absurd.
It perfectly illustrates the sheer arrogance and the casual nature of European exploration.
Yeah.
I mean, exploration wasn't an exact peer-reviewed science.
No, obviously not.
It was a lot of pointing at things, misinterpreting the answer, and writing it down in a ledger. Cartier points at a sprawling landscape, trying to ask what the entire region is called.
And his guides are just looking at their town.
Logically, they think he's pointing at the local settlement, the Canada. Cartier jots that down, sends the maps back to Europe, and suddenly an entire geographic mass is labeled forever.
It's the equivalent of me pointing at the entire eastern seaboard of North America, someone telling me that's my house, and map makers permanently labeling 1,000,000 square miles my house.
Exactly. But that label on a map is incredibly powerful. Once a European monarch sees a name on a piece of parchment, they start asking how they can extract value from it.
Which brings us to the early 1600s. The land is mapped, it's been mistakenly named, and now France decides to actually build an empire.
Time to set up shop.
Right. In 1604, Pierre de Monts and Samuel de Champlain settle in Acadia, which is modern-day Nova Scotia.
Yeah.
And then in 1608, Champlain hits a massive milestone.
Quebec City.
Yeah, he founds a fortress at what is now Quebec City. But he doesn't just build a fort and lock the gates. He immediately forms active alliances with the Algonquin, the Montagnais, and the Huron.
Because Champlain understands that a fortress is useless without an economy. You need trade. And the entire economy of this new colony, New France, becomes fiercely and single-mindedly driven by one incredibly lucrative commodity.
The beaver pelts.
The European demand for beaver pelts, yes.
I really want to dig into the mechanics of this because I don't think people realize just how obsessive the European market was. Why beaver pelts?
It was entirely driven by the fashion trends in Paris and London.
Fashion.
Yeah, specifically hats. The underfur of the beaver has these tiny barbs that make it perfect for creating high-quality felt.
Oh, interesting.
And that felt was used to make hats that held their shape and were naturally water-resistant. The European beaver had been hunted almost to extinction by this point.
So they needed a new supply.
Exactly. So when they realized North America was teeming with them, it sparked an absolute gold rush.
A gold rush built entirely on rodent fur. That is amazing. And this requires a massive infrastructure, obviously. The sources mention key figures like Jean Talon, Bishop Laval, and Count Frontenac working to expand this French empire. But it's the on-the-ground mechanics that fascinate me. You have these French traders, the voyageurs and the coureurs des bois. What exactly were their roles?
This is where the alliances Champlain built become crucial. A coureur des bois, which literally translates to runner of the woods, was essentially an independent, unlicensed entrepreneur.
Like a freelancer?
Yeah, basically. They would leave the French settlements and embed themselves completely with the indigenous tribes. They learned the languages, adopted the survival techniques, and established deep, direct supply chains for the furs.
And the voyageurs?
The voyageurs were the licensed muscle. They paddled these massive, heavy canoes deep into the continent's river systems to transport those goods back to Montreal.
Okay, looking at how this operation functioned, it feels eerily similar to how modern tech monopolies operate. The French built a decentralized gig worker network.
That is a great way to put it.
They sent their agents directly to the source. But then the British decide they want in on the action.
They do, and they make their move in 1670. King Charles II of England essentially signs a piece of paper granting the Hudson's Bay Company exclusive commercial rights over the entire massive area of land that drains into Hudson Bay.
So the Hudson's Bay Company sets up on the water. They build massive forts which act like a centralized platform.
Right.
They don't send runners into the woods. They demand the First Nations bring the furs directly to them at the bay. You literally have a centralized platform competing against a decentralized gig network for absolute market dominance.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you see European fashion trends directly driving North American exploration.
Wow.
And just like modern corporate warfare, they were undercutting each other, trying to lock the indigenous suppliers into exclusive contracts, and racing to control the distribution route.
It's ruthless.
It was. But the butterfly effect of this economic competition is profound. To secure more furs, both the British and the French pushed deeper and deeper into the continent, and eventually a continent that massive somehow becomes too small for both of them.
Which means the boardroom negotiations fail, the corporate monopolies call in the militaries, and the friction over resources turns into a violently literal collision of empires.
By the 1700s, that commercial competition inevitably boils over into a struggle for total military control of North America.
And according to the records, that struggle climaxes in the year 1759 at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, right outside Quebec City.
Yes, a massive turning point.
This isn't just a skirmish, it's a brutal, decisive fight. Both commanding generals, the British James Wolfe and the French Marquis de Montcalm, they both die in the battle.
Both of them, yeah.
And the British absolutely crush the French forces.
It is the definitive end of the French Empire in America. The British take control and rename the massive colony the province of Quebec.
But they inherit a major problem. They now have a massive population of French Catholic citizens, known in the sources as the Canadians or the habitants.
Right, living right inside a British Protestant empire.
And this is where the records present something that absolutely shatters the standard historical playbook. In 1774, the British passed the Quebec Act.
Easily one of the most critical pieces of legislation in the history of the continent.
The sources state that the Quebec Act allowed Catholic religious freedom, permitted Catholics to hold public office, and restored French civil law while keeping British criminal law. I have to push back on the logic of this from an 18th century perspective. If the British just decisively won a war, their own commanding general died to secure this territory. Why on earth would the conquering empire immediately pass a law giving the conquered French population their religion and civil laws back?
It seems counterintuitive.
Doesn't that go against the whole conquering empire playbook? I mean, for thousands of years, the rule has been you conquer and you force the losers to assimilate to your language and your rules.
It completely violates the imperial playbook. And that is exactly why it is a stroke of absolute strategic brilliance.
How so?
You have to look at the broader political map of the 1770s. The British didn't pass the Quebec Act out of a sudden burst of modern tolerance. They passed it out of sheer paranoia.
Paranoia of what?
Of the 13 British colonies situated just south of Quebec.
Oh.
The Crown is watching those southern colonies become increasingly restless. They are protesting taxes, they are forming militias. I mean, they are clearly on the verge of outright rebellion.
Right, the rumblings of the American Revolution.
Exactly. The British military command looks at the map and does the math. They have a rebellious British population in the south and a newly conquered, disgruntled French population in the north.
Oh, I see. If Britain tries to crush the culture of the French Canadians, they create an enemy in the north right when they can least afford it.
Precisely. If they force the French to assimilate, the Canadians will absolutely join forces with the American rebels in the south, and Britain will lose the entire North American continent in one sweep.
So it was damage control.
By passing the Quebec Act, the British essentially execute a preemptive strike of tolerance. They accommodate the conquered population to ensure their loyalty, or at the very least their neutrality.
They bought their loyalty with civil liberties, and the timing couldn't have been more critical. Because just 2 years later, in 1776, those 13 colonies to the south do rebel.
They declare independence and form the United States of America.
And the immediate consequence of that revolution is a massive demographic shock to the Canadian colonies. Suddenly, this newly formed province of Quebec, with its protected French civil laws, and the maritime region of Nova Scotia, they become a northern refuge.
Yes, and that influx fundamentally alters the DNA of the region.
The sources track over 40,000 people fleeing the American Revolution to head north. These were the Loyalists, people who wanted to remain loyal to the British Crown.
So you suddenly have a massive English-speaking Protestant population moving into territories that were previously dominated by French Catholics and Indigenous groups.
No. And the records make a point to highlight that this 40,000 included roughly 3,000 Black Loyalists.
A very important detail.
These were both free and enslaved Black people who fled the United States, navigating the chaos of the Revolution to seek a better life and freedom across the northern border. So you have this incredibly complex, incredibly fragmented population awkwardly sharing space under the British flag.
A fragmented population that the newly formed United States is watching very, very closely. The tension between the U.S. and Britain doesn't end with the Revolution. It simmers for decades.
Which brings us to the true crucible of this entire timeline, the War of 1812. The United States decides to invade Canada.
They make their move.
Now, setting the stage here, the U.S. command assumes this is going to be a walk in the park.
Yeah, completely.
They look north, they see a tiny garrison of British soldiers, a bunch of disgruntled French Canadians, Indigenous tribes who have been pushed around by colonial powers, and a bunch of recent American refugees.
It looks like a house of cards.
Exactly. They figure the moment the U.S. Army marches across the border, the whole colony will just fold and welcome them.
It was a catastrophic miscalculation of how these disparate groups viewed their own survival. The Americans expected a fragmented colony to collapse. Instead, they hit a brick wall.
So how did this supposedly fractured colony manage to hold the line against a full-scale invasion? Like, who actually fought back?
It required an unprecedented, almost unthinkable coalition. You have the regular British soldiers, certainly, but they couldn't do it alone. The defense relied heavily on Canadian volunteers and, crucially, on First Nations alliances.
Right, the Indigenous alliances.
The sources highlight Chief Tecumseh, a brilliant Shawnee leader. He didn't fight for the British out of blind loyalty.
What did you do with them?
He allied his Confederacy with them because he saw an American defeat as the only way to secure an independent Indigenous state in the West.
Wow, so it was a strategic alliance of survival, and the records mention Major General Sir Isaac Brock working directly with Tecumseh.
Brock was a fascinating tactician. He actually managed to capture Detroit from the Americans early in the war.
Wait, really? Detroit?
Yeah, though he was later killed defending Queenston Heights.
Yeah.
But the defense wasn't just military generals. It relied on a sprawling network of civilian courage. You have Laura Secord, who undertook a grueling, miles-long trek through treacherous wilderness entirely on foot.
Oh, wow.
To deliver intelligence that warned the British and Mohawk forces of a surprise American attack.
The intelligence network was just as critical as the front lines. And speaking of the front lines, what about the French Canadians? Did the British strategy with the Quebec Act actually pay off when the bullets started flying?
It paid off entirely. Look at the Battle of Chateauguay in 1813. You have Charles de Salaberry, a French-Canadian officer, commanding a force made up almost entirely of French-Canadian soldiers and Mohawk warriors.
No British regulars.
Mostly just them. And they used their intimate knowledge of the local woods to tactically outmaneuver and decisively halt a much larger advancing American army.
Okay, so what does this all mean? Let's look at the sheer historical irony of that cast of characters. You have First Nations warriors, British Loyalists, and French Canadians. If we look at the timeline of the previous 2 centuries we just unpacked, these groups spent almost all of their history fiercely competing against each other.
Undercutting each other's trade networks.
Fighting bloody wars for dominance. But the very second the United States tries to invade, they all lock shields.
Because they recognize a common existential threat. They may have had deep divisions, but none of them wanted to be absorbed by the United States.
When the dust finally settles on the War of 1812, the American invasion is a total failure. They are pushed back across the line. But the real takeaway in these records isn't just that they held the territory, it's the psychological shift.
This raises an important question about identity, really.
Yeah, by standing side by side in the trenches to defend their shared space, this wildly unlikely coalition accidentally forged the foundation of a modern national identity.
It fundamentally answers the question of what makes a nation. This specific war effectively drew the permanent modern border, proving that Canada's existence wasn't a geographical accident, but a deliberate choice made by the people living there.
All right, to lock this deep dive into your memory, let's run through the chain of causality one more time. We start with a perfectly balanced, diverse ecosystem of First Nations.
Then the Vikings touched down briefly.
Right. But the real disruption begins when biology and European explorers arrive.
Cartier misunderstands the word Canada, cementing the nation's name.
And that mapping triggers an economic gold rush for beaver pelts. leading the French gig workers and the centralized British forts into a fierce corporate war.
which explodes into actual war at the Plains of Abraham, ending the French Empire.
But the British, fearing a rebellion in the south, passed the brilliant Quebec Act to secure French loyalty.
Then the American Revolution sends 40,000 Loyalists fleeing north, creating a complex bilingual society.
And finally, when the U.S. tries to invade in 1812 expecting an easy victory, that complex society bands together First Nations, British, and French to defend the border and officially secure their independence.
It is a remarkable, chaotic sequence of cause and effect.
It really is. So the next time you look at a map of North America and you trace that long, straight line separating Canada from the U.S., remember that it is not just a polite administrative boundary.
Right.
It is a scar of survival, fiercely defended by a coalition of people who had every reason to hate each other, but chose to fight together.
And as we close the books on these sources, I want to leave you with a thought about the sheer fragility of history. Every single event we just analyzed hung by a thread.
Totally.
Think about the alternative timelines. What would the continent actually look like today if the United States had actually succeeded in their easy invasion in 1812? Or zoom all the way back to that riverbank with Jacques Cartier. What if his indigenous guides had simply used a different word to describe their home instead of Canada?
How many of our modern identities are based on a single battle or a simple mistranslation? The entire identity of the second largest country on Earth rests on those moments.
It forces you to realize that the orderly, inevitable history we are taught is just an illusion. The reality was unpredictable, incredibly messy, and constantly hanging in the balance.
Which is exactly why you have to look past the polite stereotypes to see how the machinery of history actually works. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the records. Keep digging into the mechanics of the past, and we'll see you next time.